This is the second in my series of redoing my oldest videos every month, and we have a classic here. This alternate history has been done more times than I can count, and is popular for a reason. The Civil War is a seminal conflict in American history. It resolved the age-old conflict between North and South, unified America into a single centralized country instead of a federation of states. It was one of the first industrialized wars ever, and it ended slavery. So it really begs the question, what if the South did win the Civil War? What would borders be like? What would culture be like? That is a question of this alternate history. So there are two major points that the South could have won the war, Gettysburg and Antietam. Gettysburg has done too much and so ahead with Antietam this timeline. Confederate General Robert E. Lee had a plan called Plan 191. The southern defenses of Washington, D.C., the Union capital, were very heavily defended, so Lee planned to swing to the north of the city and catch the Union armies off their guard on their northern flank. He would then march in a major northern city like Philadelphia or Baltimore. Then he would cut off the rail lines connecting Washington to the rest of the Union, thus seize Washington and force the Union to sue for peace. This plan would have worked except for one of the strange chances of history. A Confederate scout got off his horse and took a leak. This resulted in him dropping the plans out of his pocket. This was later found by Union forces who gave it to General McClellan, who knew the Confederate plans. It's moments like this that are like Joan of Arc when I wonder if God intervenes in history, but my Southern and English ancestors would probably hang me for saying that. He intercepted the Confederates at the Battle of Antietam Creek, which was the best ground for the Union forces. After thick fighting and the bloodiest day in American history, the Confederates were unable to push forward and so pulled back. The Confederates tried to invade the North a year afterwards, but were defeated at Gettysburg, and the nail was hammered into the coffin of the Confederacy. In this timeline, the paper never falls out of the scouts' pocket, and so Plan 191 happens. The Confederates march into southern Pennsylvania unopposed. They catch the Union force off guard somewhere near Lancaster, and the Confederates, able to choose their ground, and the Union force, led by McClellan. For those of you who aren't Civil War nerds, consider yourself very lucky for not having heard of such a weakling loser. I'd guess the Union forces would lose. If not, it's just a repeat of Gettysburg, which ends this alternate history, so let's assume the Confederates win. The remaining Union forces pull back to defend Philadelphia, the second largest city in the country, and the Confederates seize Baltimore and Washington. People like to say the South could never have won the Civil War because the North had 3 times the manpower, had ridiculously more industry, etc. These people are wrong. Wars are not won on paper, and the South could have won for a couple reasons. Firstly, the North had clueless generals for the first part of the war. Lee just defeated them one after the other. I'm looking at you, McClellan. Thank God for General Meade and Grant, who pulled the show together and finally won the war. Secondly, many Northerners didn't see the point in continuing the war. Until the North won the main battles, anti-war sentiment was growing, and before Gettysburg and Vicksburg, it looked like the pro-peace party would win, again led by our homie McClellan, in the 1864 election instead of the pro-war Republicans. Also, Britain and France vaguely supported the Confederacy. The British were worried that a united America would threaten Britain as the dominant world power, and felt that by splitting America in two, they could stop this. The French, meanwhile, were trying to colonize Mexico, and were worried that a united America would drive them out. Also, both Britain and France were dependent on southern cotton for their industries, and the Union blockade was strangling this. However, the British knew a decision to support the pro-slavery Confederacy would be unpopular, and so wanted to wait until the South won an undeniable victory. Meanwhile, France, who was much weaker than Britain, wanted Britain to okay any war with the Union before getting involved. This would mean that if the Confederates won an undeniable victory, the British and French would likely support them, likely recognizing them as an independent nation and threatening to attack the Union blockade, and possibly bombard the eastern shore of America if the Union didn't acknowledge the Confederacy's independence. So under all these circumstances, the Northern opposition would crumble and the North would be forced to recognize Southern independence and sign a peace treaty. The treaty would likely look something like this. The classic Confederate states would likely gain independence. The Potomac is simply so defensible a line that I don't see the Confederates taking Maryland. Also, losing their former capital would be too hard a point for the Union to concede. I'm not sure about Kentucky. It all depends on whether the Union forces are defeated by Kirby Smith's Confederate forces when they invade Kentucky. Oklahoma, or as it was known then, Indian Country, in which the native tribes mainly supported the Confederacy, would join the Confederacy as well. Missouri tried to join the Confederacy, but it had its own mini-civil war in which the Union factions won. Also, Missouri simply juts too far north. It would screw up the whole Union supply lines across the continent, heading west. What would become Arizona and New Mexico weren't those states yet. The region was divided north-south, with the Arizona Territory being the southern half and the New Mexico Territory being the northern half. New Mexico was under Union domination and Arizona part of the Confederacy. Actually, after the war, the states were divided east-west, so the Southerners wouldn't be able to get a majority in either, and get an entire state of the West. In this timeline, the Confederates would just get the Arizona Territory. After the Civil War, the Union would continue to industrialize, much as it did in our timeline. The factors that let the North industrialize would still exist, because after the Civil War in our timeline, the South was frankly economically irrelevant. Some people liked saying the South's reparation payments would be so large the Northern economy would be crushed. This is ridiculous. The North's economy was simply so large that this never could have happened. The North likely wouldn't purchase Alaska from the Russians. The recent shock of losing the war would likely mean that the North wouldn't be feeling very adventurous. The purchase of Alaska was seen as worthless at the time, and the Americans would also be worried the superior British Navy would seize it in the next war. Washington is right across the river from Virginia and the Confederacy, meaning the Union would likely move its capital north for protection. This would likely be Philadelphia, the second largest city in the country, and also the city that was the capital before Washington, which was itself a compromise with the South. Meanwhile, if they put the capital in New York or Boston, the rest of the North would preferably join the Confederacy just to make them shut up. Cotton is a very nutrient-intensive crop, which means the soils get depleted very quickly. This combined with the rapidly growing population meant the South had great land lust. In the 10 years before the Civil War, Southern pirates basically tried to conquer Honduras, Baja California, and Nicaragua. The North didn't play with this, but in this timeline that wouldn't be an issue. The Confederates would colonize and conquer Central American nations like Cuba, Nicaragua, Panama, and Guatemala. These nations were British client states, producing tropical goods for Britain, but so would the Confederacy be, and the British would probably think the Confederates more efficient farmers. Remember when I said the French were trying to colonize Mexico? Well, that really happened. The Emperor of France was trying to put a Habsburg named Maximilian on the Mexican throne. The end of the U.S. Civil War meant that the United Union forced them to pull out, thus ending French Mexico. That wouldn't happen in this timeline, especially with the friendly Confederacy to the north. The French would be able to wrestle control of Mexico, albeit unstably due to the sheer size and rough geography of the country. This unstable control, combined with aggressive Confederates to the north, would mean the French would likely sell the north of Mexico to the Confederacy. The Confederate economy likely wouldn't industrialize for a couple reasons. Firstly, agricultural prices were very high in the final part of the 19th century, meaning agricultural nations had no reason to industrialize. This is the trap Argentina and Brazil fell into. The final years of the 19th century would be the golden age of the Confederacy, along with probably the Union. God, the 1890s were a good decade. Also, Southern culture looked down upon industry, seeing it as an ungentlemanly activity and discouraged it. This would mean that Southern entrepreneurs would probably just move north into the Union, where the economic system was simply much better developed. The Southern economy also never had the excess capital for big industry, because all the extra money was simply pumped back into buying more slaves and land. Also, much of the South's climate was simply not conducive to business until air conditioning for large chunks of the year. Finally, small amounts of Southern industry would develop, because the South would be an independent country. This would, however, be organized near the Union's industrial areas due to climactic reasons and proximity to the previous Union industrial complexes, so the most industrialized parts of the South would likely be northern Kentucky near Cincinnati and northern Virginia. Slavery would be abolished at some point much later in the 19th century. The global opinion simply turned against slavery to such an extent that it would be in the South's favor to get rid of it at one point, because their British and French allies would simply get so disgusted. In the 1890s, they would likely get rid of slavery and replace it with a horrific apartheid system that wouldn't be that different. That's exactly what the South Africans did when the British forced them to get rid of slavery, but they didn't really want to do it. The North and the South would keep a massive grudge. The North would hugely outnumber the South in population and industry, and the fear of reconquest by the North and the following retributions would terrify the South. Meanwhile, the North would keep an enormous chip on its shoulder against the South for seceding, and knowing its sheer size, would not forget the South could be reconquered. As world politics would become more violent and Byzantine in the lead up to World War I, the North and South would pick different sides. The Confederates would side with the British and French, and thus the Entente, for the same reasons they fought with them 50 years earlier, because of trade ties and the British and French worries over the United States growing too powerful. Meanwhile, the United States would side with the Central Powers, mainly as a side against the Confederacy, and the US would have large populations of Germans and Irish, who would support the Central Powers. When World War I would break out, the US would come to fight a two-front war against the Confederacy, French Mexico, and British Canada. The United States would win in the end simply due to its advantage in manpower and industry. World War I was a war of attrition, which the number of troops and machines you could shove into the trenches was more important than your tactics, honestly. And the United States had its 3 to 4 times advantage in population and a massive industrial advantage. I mean, just look at this 1933 map of industry by US states. Also remember, a third of the Confederate population would be blacks, who would not be allowed for military service. The US would be able to exploit new technologies like airplanes, tanks, and the like on the level that soon would be impossible for the Confederacy. The US siding with the Central Powers would result in them winning in Europe. The US troops certainly wouldn't be helping the Allied forces at the Second Marne, which you could argue is or isn't decisive, and you will in the comments. The British would be forced to divert troops to protect Canada. It wouldn't be able to pull on Canadian troops. The Allies wouldn't be able to buy American weapons or pull on American debt either. Also, the British would have trouble getting food and raw materials, with both the Yankees and the Germans trolling the Atlantic. This would result in a worldwide Central Powers victory. In the end, the US, simply due to its massive size, would likely annex the Confederacy in its entirety as well as English-speaking Canada, while making Quebec an independent puppet state. The US would end up militarily occupying much of the continent, but exhausted from the war. Mexico would collapse into civil war, the native Mexican government seizing power, and the Central American Confederate colonies would likely become a US Banana Republic client state. Meanwhile, the Germans would likely take over their lands in Eastern Europe from the Brest-Litovsk Treaty and seize some colonies in Africa and New Guinea. The Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires would likely survive. The Japanese, who sided with the Entente, wouldn't take much of a beating and might actually backstab their European allies in exchange for some East Asian colonies when their European allies would be in free fall. The Ottomans under Ataturk could be able to reform as a Western state. Think of how powerful a modernized Turkey could be with all the oil from the Middle Eastern nations like Iraq and Saudi Arabia after they defeated the local Bedouin tribes. Meanwhile, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had plans to reform as a federation of aligned states to make it less an artificial collection of Habsburg marriages. This would result in a civil war with the Hungarians, who would lose the most privileges. However, the Germans would support the Austrian Germans and the Slavs in the Civil War, thus allowing reform. Since all nations that lost World War I fell into authoritarianism without exception, this would happen. Russia, with the Germans too exhausted to intervene, would still have the communists seize power. In general, the more advanced a society, it will collapse into fascism, and the less advanced, communism. So Britain and France would turn fascist during the downturns of the 30s. They would ally with the Russian communists, who would also have an enormous chip on their shoulder against the Germans. Of course, without losing the First World War, Hitler would never have risen to power in Germany. The Japanese would likely be working out of their own agency to expand their empire, whatever alliance that means. World War II would be the process of the World War I losers teaming up against Germany. The Germans would be attacked on two sides, by the Russians in the east and the British and the French in the west. The Russians, being terrible at offensives at the start of the war, would fail miserably in the beginning. Meanwhile, the front in the west against the British and the French would bog down without the Americans to help out the Western allies. Also, the Kaiser would honestly be so much better an alternative to Stalin that I can't see why the Russian people would fight hard in this war. The United States, having just swallowed the Confederacy in Canada and having no real investment in the conflict, would not get involved. I wouldn't be surprised if the ex-Confederates, bitter about losing the war, would rebel during World War II and be supported by the English fascists, which would then be crushed. However, the United States, after spending so much blood in defeating the Confederacy, would fall into isolationism. The Germans would eventually defeat the other European powers, as they had in World War I. They would simply control so much more of Russia than our timeline, and the Western powers would lose without America's support. This would make Germany the dominant European power. Meanwhile, the Japanese, waiting for the French, British, and Russians to be humbled by the Germans, would swoop in and steal their colonies. The Japanese would invade British Malaysia, India, and far eastern Siberia, and be victorious, with the European portions collapsing. This is what this timeline would end up looking like, with the Germans dominating Europe and its colonies. The United States would likely dominate America and Latin America, and the Japanese East Asia. Whatifalthist, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please comment, subscribe, and support me on Patreon. Also, if you liked this video, you would like Harry Turtledove's Southern Victory series, which is an 11-volume epic set in the world where the South won the Civil War. It's got a lot of similarities to this timeline, and that's purely coincidental. We reached a lot of the same logical conclusions working independently. But still, you would probably really like it and should check it out. Almost everything by Harry Turtledove is pretty good. From the stuff I've made, you would probably like my video on what if the American Revolution failed. Spoilers, it's much worse than you'd ever imagine. Or you'd like my video about what if the US annexed Yucatan in southern Mexico during the Mexican-American War. As always, thank you for watching and have a good day.